Okay, the lies.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Keisha Rogers, and I wanted to have the pleasure today to introduce to you our special guest and my friend and colleague from the LaRouche PAC Policy Committee, who sits on the policy committee with me. Today, we are coming off a very exciting moment and potential for the nation. And the question is how we move the nation forward with the solutions, concrete solutions needed for bringing into this new presidency the uncapturing and unleashing of the potential for new relationships amongst nations, amongst people, for mankind as a whole, and to actually bring the nation together around the idea that now we have avoided the continued policy of war, continued policy of regime change for the time being. And we just can't talk about the negative. We also have to talk about the positive solutions that are now ripe to be brought into fruition, to be brought into existence. And you will hear today where we are already seeing the potential there that the enemy is completely Wall Street, the British Empire, and those who've tried to keep the progress of this nation and mankind down, completely freaked out about what can be brought about. But I want to say this, and Michael will develop this more. The real question is not about what the newly elected president is going to do for you, but I think it's, as John Kennedy said, what are you going to do for your nation? The ball is in the court of the people, and we can't just sit back and wait to see what's going to happen, how this president is going to respond. We have to demand action, and we have to know what we're fighting for. And if anybody knows how to do that, it's Lyndon LaRouche and this movement. And what Michael and I have been engaged with our colleagues on the policy committee in creating and working on in terms of presenting the concrete solutions that have to be defined and have to be adopted, which start with Lyndon LaRouche's 4 laws to save the United States. And Glass-Steagall is only the beginning. So let me just stop there. I wanted to give those brief remarks and introduction and let Michael take over. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks, Keisha. Okay, let me just take up what Keisha just referenced, because it is important given the inauguration speech that just happened yesterday. The President Trump gave a series of what they called a victory tour. And in that victory tour, he had a common refrain near the end of his speeches, which was that the final chapter of this book has not been written. For the first time, it will be written by you. That's to some degree that quality that he captured in his inauguration, that the government is finally back into the hands of the people, is a very important concept. But I would say that it's not so much the final chapter of this book. It perhaps is the first chapter of a new book. And that first chapter is going to be critical for where this book goes. And that in essence, we are at a real turning point if we indeed take the opportunity to fulfill it, to enter into a new era of humankind. And this is not uncharacteristic. The same quality of change, but in an opposite direction, was felt similarly about a century ago with the advent of World War I. There was an industrial take, there was a, this time it's different. This time there's an optimistic shift. And we have to write that. Now what I want to do is 2 aspects. I'm sure there might be disagreements. And if you have them, you may raise them. But I will, there's 2 aspects I want to take up in the political situation. I've been asked to do 2 things. One, give a political overview, and then secondly, give a certain conceptual presentation. So I'm going to try to do that as seamlessly as I can. And there are 2 parts to the political situation we have to take into account. So the first is what a well-known classical conductor, Wilhelm Furtwängler, identified within classical composition and performance. That there's a quality of what you would call near hearing and far hearing. And the difficulty of the American population today is that because of the lack of education, not just in the schools, which is near approaching menticide of the children, but just culturally. There's a lack of education culturally. You see this in the media. But there's a quality of near hearing and far hearing that's captured within any real human culture. It's a way of thinking that you recognize there are immediate aspects that are taking place that you have to have an understanding of. There also has to be then a broader context for those developments. And you have to see both as a constant interplay. The one obviously moves slower over longer waves, the other one moves much more quickly. But you have to see the interaction between both. So let me take up the first part, which is the near hearing, or the immediate events that are unfolding upon us right now. Now, I imagine most people watched the inauguration speech yesterday. Okay. There were clearly, President Trump took a specific tone. I don't know if you would say that it wasn't a comprehensive tone. We don't know yet what this administration is entirely going to do. It definitely left certain questions to be answered. But I think that was intended. The problem is it doesn't resolve those questions. What he made clear is that this administration is going to take on the Washington and somewhat this transatlantic establishment. That was made crystally clear. There was not even a compromise in tone. There was no. It was a declaration of war, in essence, that he made yesterday against this establishment. No concession at all. I mean, never before has an inauguration speech ridiculed the very members behind him the way that President Trump did yesterday. Now, and he prefaced it all on the question that this is a time for action, and implicitly action now. Now that comes from Franklin Roosevelt's inaugural speech. However, Franklin Roosevelt also had the guts and courage to take on the money changers in the temple, to take on Wall Street. Now that was not done by President Trump. And that's a question that has to be answered. It's a very important question if this administration and this country, because it's not just this administration, it's the entire nation, who has a responsibility to begin to rebuild and develop our own population, our own land area, our own manufacturing centers. We have a responsibility to do that. Not just President Trump and this administration. But if we're going to be able to do that, then steps to shut down Wall Street are going to be required. He also made reference in his speech to the forgotten man. Again, another reference specifically to Franklin Roosevelt's entire campaign and presidency, a dedication in that sense. It was indeed, people have seen the iconic picture of President Franklin Roosevelt in his car, paralyzed from the waist down, meeting with coal miners from West Virginia. It's not surprising that President Trump took West Virginia by 42 points in the federal election in November. The Democratic Party has essentially become the party of Wall Street once again, entirely. And we can go into some of the dynamics, but I'm not going to do much of that today. But we can certainly conclude, without describing it much, the Democratic Party is in a wasteland, and the only soul it will find will be the soul that Mr. LaRouche and our organization have made clear for decades, which is the policies of Glass-Steagall to shut down Wall Street, the policies of Alexander Hamilton, of a national banking system and industrialization, and policies of a scientific program, of the space program, of fusion energy, of real development. But going with sexual issues, or gender issues, or war with Russia, or backing intelligence agencies that approximate Nazi programs and outlooks, is not going to be heartwarming to the American people and will not gain their favor. And in that sense, maybe the Democratic Party is dead. To a large extent, both parties are dead. Now, there were also discussions in Congress with some of Trump's nominees. One of them was Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. Now, in this discussion, yeah, perhaps he got that's where the devil got him, was in the minutia. But what transpired there was specifically what I just laid out as Mr. LaRouche in our program. You have to have basic policies immediately going forward. The first and foremost is Glass-Steagall. Does anybody not know what Glass-Steagall is in this audience? You're not sure? Okay, Glass-Steagall is a basic policy. Wall Street's been running, this came up with a discussion yesterday, Wall Street's been running a pyramid scheme for decades. And in 1998, 99, that pyramid scheme was allowed by the federal government to access your banking system, the American banking system, the commercial deposits, your business accounts, the American people's banking system. Not the Wall Street white shoe, not the rich people's banking system, the American banking system. That pyramid scheme was finally given access to your banking system by the repeal of Glass-Steagall. And from that point on, they've held the American people, Wall Street has, and the American government hostage. You saw this in the 2008 financial crisis, that they were held hostage. The government did not take the actions necessary to protect the people. They basically placated Wall Street. Financial terrorists, in essence. Now, Glass-Steagall would come back and it would separate those institutions. It would prevent that pyramid scheme from being connected to our banking system. It would protect the American people, and it would force that pyramid scheme to exist on its own, and it would largely collapse. Now, that's technically what it does. Philosophically, what it does is specifically what Mr. President Trump is promising to the American people. It will give you your nation back. It will give you your government back. It allows the American people to take on the initiatives of real development. And that's important. Now, Mr. Trump has been, as Mr. LaRouche described today, based on a number of actions that President Trump took, that President Trump so far has been very cautious. He's playing it safe in terms of what his economic policy is. How is he going to accomplish these things is fairly opaque. At the hearing with his Treasury Secretary, nominee, Mnuchin, he was asked on the question of Glass-Steagall. And the Treasury Secretary was obtuse, was not clear. And he's clearly not a very good, even though he might have made reference to Alexander Hamilton in his opening remarks, which is perhaps better, as people would say, than making reference to Adam Smith, or wearing an Adam Smith tie, or quoting Milton Friedman. That's certainly better than quoting Milton Friedman. There's not a commitment. Now, in this administration, it's fairly clear that there are a grouping of people who are aware of Glass-Steagall, and in some cases support it. Whether they're in the White House, they're part of the Trump team, the Trump program, the campaign. Mr. LaRouche did an interview with one of the Trump's advisors, informal advisors, a guy named Roger Stone. The first thing Roger Stone asked Mr. LaRouche in this interview, in the middle of November, was, tell us the importance of Glass-Steagall, because I think Trump's going to do this. Tell us the importance of it, Mr. LaRouche. So clearly there are some people who are aware of it, know Mr. LaRouche's outlook that this is the existential question, and that Trump should and can pass this legislation. But there are others, a coterie of Goldman Sachs and Wall Street bankers who have come into this administration. Not surprising, been standard practice for decades inside a presidential administration. But there's clearly resistance. This is probably the first time that a Treasury Secretary has had to actually answer that question since Glass-Steagall was repealed. Where do you stand on Glass-Steagall? This was done by Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington. That's the first time that's happened. There's pressure, and he had to admit that he's looking at it, but perhaps not the way Glass-Steagall was by Franklin Roosevelt. Perhaps we can change it a little bit. Okay, not a very good answer. That's a pretty big window of well, we can change it. We'll change it how? But the fact that you have a senator from Washington who's been a leading figure on this question of Glass-Steagall for a decade, pushing that issue, pushing him her entire questioning session, is the right direction. The question is that this is not going. This policy cannot and will not be shaped by Goldman Sachs bankers, Wall Street, and their faction inside this administration. It will be shaped only by the actions the American people take. That chapter, this book, in its introduction and its chapters, will be written by the American people and their dedication to fight for that. So while all these Democrats, backed up by Wall Street and the CIA, pushing for war with Russia, and a shutdown of human population growth, should be instead fighting for Glass-Steagall and the basic policies to save the country. They're instead, in some infantile protest mode. That's a failure. As Friedrich Schiller said during the French Revolution, that it's a great moment which found a little people. Those are the very little people he was referencing. And the challenge is on us to be large enough to recognize that Trump is willing to fight. That's clear. He's going to fight. He fought the entire way through. He destroyed, and this is in broad daylight. He destroyed the Bush Republican Party. He mangled it. And then he did the same thing to the entire Obama-Clinton legacy. Now the question is, we have to write the pages of this book and develop the policy. Now there's a couple other developments that are very important in that regard, before I maybe broaden it a little bit. People probably haven't heard of this, but there's a project, perhaps you have, but there's a project called the Kra Canal. This is the Kra Canal built in the Isthmus of Kra along the very narrow strip of Thailand going into Malaysia. Oh, there's a map. So right here. It's actually at the most narrow crossing, more narrow than the Panama Canal. It is a project which has been discussed for over a century and has always been prevented largely by the British monarchy, by a British imperial domination of the seas. People may know, but Singapore, which is at the end of the Malaysian peninsula here, controls the main waterway from the South China Sea into the Indian Ocean, and then of course accessing Africa, but of course also accessing Europe. So all this discussion of the South China Sea is actually focused on this single choke point of Singapore, and which would be bypassed by a new canal through Thailand here, creating a large-scale development in this area with Myanmar and Bangladesh and India, as well as the Indian Ocean basin generally, and of course, the entire relationship between China and Europe under their new Silk Road policy. So we've presented on this extensively. Mr. LaRouche was himself personally involved in this since the 1980s. We worked with a number of leading factions, including the Mitsubishi company in Japan. This has been something that we have fought for as a critical point, because you have these choke points. You have projects which indicate a kind of a transformation. And if those projects are built, you see a complete change in the entire dynamic of the region as a whole. Just to give people a sense, we've then published an article. We've done an interview with a leading figure from Thailand who's been advocating for this project. What is Pakti's last name?
Thanampura.
Thanampura, yeah, Pakti Thanampura. And we published that on our website, and it was immediately picked up by a leading Singapore newspaper, literally within a day or two, who freaked out that Singapore will lose all relevance if this canal is built. Now, Singapore wouldn't lose any relevance. If you create a major economic development of that region, not all the ships, 40% of world trade, or 20 to 40% of world trade passes through here. You're not going to get all of those ships through there as fast as possible. Some will still go around Singapore, but the whole region will boom. But the whole region will boom, not just Singapore, not just the very isolated specific points of the British Empire, not these very isolated choke points, like we have with the Suez Canal, a major choke point, or the Straits of Gibraltar, and there are others. And in some cases, the Falkland Islands in Argentina. And there are other. This brings me to then the broader question of what this gentleman, this conductor, Wilhelm Furtwängler referenced, which is the far-hearing aspect of things. Because as soon as we discuss something like the Kra Canal, this is now the reason this is under such discussion, and why the Singapore Times freaked out so much, is because there's a new king. The old king who passed away was totally against this project. There's a new king
In Thailand?
in Thailand. He seems to be for it. The Privy Council, which I don't know if it's connected to the British Privy Council or it's just an advisory council, but it's a largely military backing. They're for it. The military is largely for it. And Chinese companies have declared that this particular route that they've chosen, there's 5 or 6 that have been identified, that it's shovel ready. They're ready to build it. They just need to be signed off by the current government. Now, that hasn't been done, but it likely could be. And in the context of a new administration in the United States, who is not intending to have war with China and to control the South China Sea, could certainly be open to that kind of project. The Japanese, now working with Russia and potentially China, would open up that kind of project. And you would see a potential for a renaissance of collaboration among nations. That's so key. And that's what we mean by a platform, a project that indicates a higher platform. That some projects that can be built indicate a kind of a situation which become a precedent. And because of the precedent, it opens up an entirely different relationship among the nations in that region and a standard of what that collaboration is going to accomplish. Now, this is important, and Mr. LaRouche commented on this today. There are some people who are a little bit worried that Trump is saying America first, America first, America first. This sounds isolationist, this sounds nationalistic. The most rabid establishment times are promoting a line that this is a fascism, this is Mussolini, this is Hitler policy. Mr. LaRouche's response was different. That every nation has a right to determine what's in its own interest. And that no nation can know what the best interest is of all other nations. Only each nation can know what's in its best interest. And that seems to make a lot of sense. And that must have been how the world worked up until all of us were born. But perhaps not, right? Perhaps it's never been the way the world worked. Have the nations of Africa really been at their disposal to develop the way they decided to develop? Have the nations of South America, have nations like India or Pakistan or Southeast Asia been given the chance to develop? So that notion, as simple as it is also incredibly profound and revolutionary. It's transformative as a conception. Now, that's oftentimes how profound revolutions take place, by very simple ideas that have just seemingly been overlooked or pushed aside, or most people just thought could never happen, and they had to adapt and accept the way things were, be practical, survive, get through the day. That's how most Americans have been living these last 16 to 40 years, have been just survive, get through it. At some point, the drug addiction will stop. At some point, the crime infestation and shutdown of industry will stop. At some point, the inflation will stop. At some point, the education will finally get better. How long have we been talking as a nation about improving education in the inner cities? Just 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, forever.
Right, forever. So at some point, it's just going to happen. Simple ideas sometimes are revolutionary in their nature. So these projects, one of them is the Kra Canal. Another one is the project in this area of Africa. This is Lake Chad. It's right at the northeast corner of Nigeria. And it is a project which would largely extend through the Congo River Basin, which is in this area here, the Democratic Republic of Congo. It touches on, this is the Nile River Basin here. This is the Congo Basin, and it flows out of the Congo River here. It would be to take along the highlands between the Congo Basin and the Nile and collect off of tributaries to Lake Chad, I'm sorry, tributaries to the Congo, a canal and basically a man-made river, which would have a flow larger than the Nile River itself to begin to replenish Lake Chad and to help develop this entire area. Now, Chad, as many people know, is right here is the Sahara Desert. This is a very arid area, perfect for growing food. you don't know that, come out to California, come visit us sometime. It's one thing we do in California that's still halfway decent. Everything else is crazy. You've heard those stories, they're all true and worse. But the one thing we do is the Central Valley is a miracle phenomenon. It just can grow everything, and bigger than anywhere else. I often tell a story, but there was a Chinese professor whose friend came over, and he told him, we can grow everything in the Central Valley. And the professor said, well, I want to see a Chinese date. People have seen these. They're kind of red, small, they're kind of tough, but they're Chinese dates. They often grow them in the deserts of China, out in the western part of China. At least they're working on it in arid areas. So I want to see a Chinese date. His friend said, why would we grow a Chinese date? We can grow the really good Middle Eastern, Egyptian dates. Why would we grow the Chinese dates? So they're driving down the road, and his friend tells him, stop, stop, stop. What? He stops. So they pull the car over in a country road. He says, look, there's a whole field of Chinese date trees. And they're the biggest Chinese dates they've ever seen. So that same kind of miracle can take place right in the center of Africa. With a river flow the size of the Nile River. This is the potential. This would mean a collaboration of nations. Chinese companies are already talking about building this. We've worked with Italian engineering companies which have designed it. It's been designed, it's ready to build, as they call it, shovel ready. And it would require the collaborations of China, Africa, and Germany's increasing policy in statement is that Germany has to be involved with Africa in this way to solve the migrant crisis, to address the real problems of Africa, and so on. It would require and should involve and give Europe a new leg on life, you might say, of a certain morality, to help develop this, because that project, with the collaboration of 5, 6, 7 major African nations, would set the precedent and foundation for a platform of development in Africa that would really begin to address the immoral nature, the immoral condition mankind is compromised with for far too long. Especially, at least, since the end of World War II, when this kind of development was clearly possible. So this is the other couple of projects that are just worthwhile pointing out. One is the project here, going from China, Korea, Japan, and Russia into the Bering Strait, into Alaska, with their high-speed rail system, accessing the development of Western Canada, Western United States, and really giving a foundation for a high-speed rail system in the United States. Even the Republicans who think high-speed rail is a crazy communist conspiracy of California liberals are forced to have to consider the fact that a high-speed rail going through the Bering Strait might actually be worthwhile and change everything. Because it does change everything. It's not a scheme to take people from Hollywood up to San Francisco and back down again, which is generally what the concoction is. But frankly, it'll never happen, because another funny story from a Chinese professor, he's an engineering one, and he said, do you think China's communist? And I said, I don't know, it depends on what you mean. He says, well, I'll tell you one thing, California is more communist than China has ever been. And I believe him. I have no doubts at all. So, so this Bering Strait project, there's also one here that many people are unaware of. It's called the Darien Gap. It's an area of swamps here in southern Panama, I believe, in this part of Colombia, which no rail line has been built. There's I think one highway, one narrow
highways.
Not even a highway.
Nothing goes through it.
Nothing goes through
But it's just like Louisiana over here. I just fly a swamp. We got it 20 miles.
Right, so if we can build it in Louisiana,
yeah,
we can build it there. Yeah. And if they can build it on frozen, they can build these high-speed rails on frozen tundra up in the Himalayas. We can probably build it through some swamps. So then all of a sudden there's a rail line already coming from Djibouti to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. This is a continental east to west line that would go through Nigeria into West Africa. We then potentially have one going from Cairo down to Johannesburg, Cape Town. You then have a rail going from the Bering Straits into the United States. This area of the southwest United States, with a rail line coming from the Bering Strait, but one also going down into South America. Between Mexico, Central and South America is about 600 million people, about twice the size of the US population. This area of the country will become an industrial production center, both with aerospace and the space sector and NASA for our space exploration program, for export and production of industry for this entire area of the world, with the most efficient means of transportation of high-speed rail. That's how we used to think. That was the proposals that this country would at one time consider. Now these are the platform projects. There are others, and to a certain extent, we are having to fight now because so much is developing. China is planning to build the Canal. It's very close, as I said. The Transaqua is now going forward. There are 38 rail lines going from China into somewhere in Europe, including all the way to Portugal and even London through the tunnel. And that includes going into Pakistan. There's going to be a rail line from Iran up into Moscow, what they call the North-South corridor. There could be even a canal from the Gulf of Oman into the Caspian Sea, making these Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and Russia having access directly into the Indian Ocean basin by shipping. These are major projects. They're in discussion. And we are continuing to put out reports. Our organization, if you don't know, have been involved in proposing these for 30 years. Yeah?
I was just going to ask, how is this technology going to be powered? What are you going to use for the fuel to make it run?
The high-speed rail?
Okay, yes, for that.
Okay, well, I mean, I mean, there is an interesting question. The rail platform is going to be a fusion-based platform. The high-speed rails are electrified. That's their main source. China is upgrading a lot of their rail lines to be electrification instead of diesel. It is a question, though. How do we have to do this kind of development? You essentially want an infinite or unlimited supply of electricity, and that means shutting down this entire fraud of climate change and global warming and all of these questions, which an increasing number of leading scientists are now having the gumption to call out. I will say this. This is an important point of the new Trump administration. This is the first time we've had a president. Remember, your good old Texas Republican George W. Bush was the guy who made the ethanol mandate. This guy, his father goes back to one of the leading greenies. The leading conservationist in the country in the 1960s would have been George Herbert Walker Bush in the 1970s. The Bush family is no friend of mankind. This is the first time then, since environmental issues have taken a prominent role in so-called discussion of policy and what we do in the world, which is since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the advent of Al Gore, that whole fiasco. This is the first time that you've actually had a presidency in the United States which recognizes it to be a fraud. That's a big change, because you have to break that open. You have to break it open for development. You have to break it open for scientific advancement. And you have leading scientists today, some of them Nobel laureates, who recognize we may actually, as one put it in a presentation he gave, we don't know what the ideal amount of carbon dioxide in the environment is. Some are proposing that it be 2.5 times what it is today. That we should more than double our carbon dioxide in our atmosphere for plant growth, for food production, and for warming. Because what's the ideal temperature? I mean, maybe in Texas you don't want it a little bit warmer.
Nope, we don't.
But you got AC. No. But it is a question. And also the question is, how do you moderate the climate? So interesting questions. That's real climate science. Asking those questions. What's ideal? What's ideal for food production? What's ideal for human existence? What's ideal for broad-scale development? And then how do we shape that? And underlying all of this attack is really an attack on one thing: the power of mankind to act upon the universe in such a way to have such change. That is actually the one thing that these crazy greenies got right. We can act in a profound way to change the universe. Now we have to ask the question is, how do we want to change it? Not, how do we stop? Okay, so all these projects, the fusion question, the energy platform, these main projects in these various geographical regions, they situate a bigger question, which is, and as I raised earlier, this question of a sovereignty of a nation. This question of each nation has the right to decide what's in its best interest and to act upon that. That is, in essence, a Hamilton banking system. The Hamilton banking system is the power of any nation to decide what it wants to develop, how it wants to develop, and to create the means economically, both with financial capital and industry, to build that, to develop that country. That notion of sovereignty, all of these questions of development and so on, suggest that we are at a major turning point in human history. Something's taking place. And that's something that we have to actually take into account. And this is where the American people oftentimes miss. And if they do catch on, they're relegated to, oh, you're just a conspiracy theorist. Or you're probably one of those whack jobs that believes that this is all a conspiracy. This is all out to get us. And you see when people are confronted on the question of, well, if we could actually use twice as much carbon dioxide, why is everybody saying otherwise? They say, well, all the scientists don't agree. And the ones that do agree, find out where they get their money from. And you have to follow the money. But where's it all coming from? Where's all this Russia baiting coming from? Why is Russia all of a sudden the worst enemy in the world? Why is Putin now the worst tyrant in the world? All of a sudden. So it begins to beg the question, what's really at stake here? And that kind of change and the nature of how mankind relates to mankind, how nations relate to nations, and how a self-conception of humanity. How do we conceive of human existence? We had a presentation on Thursday, and Pete read a sermon from Martin Luther King, What is Man? But it's what Martin Luther King addressed 40 years ago, 50 years ago, was as if it could be read today with the same pertinence, same value. Because he recognized this is the question, this bigger, the far hearing, that MLK had a very unique quality. He could hear the far tones of history, the long arc, as he put it. And that characteristic has to be grasped, because it means that we understand how do we make this book effective? How do we write the chapters of this book? How do we develop this process? You can't respond day to day to the events. You have to see, what are we actually attempting to accomplish? From our perspective, that's an eradication of the British Empire system, to shut it down. Shut down this conception of man, of humanity, that some are relegated to slaves, while others are meant to rule. An old imperial notion. That's the power, if Trump fulfills it in policy, of giving the government back to the American population, of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that question is a bigger question. Now, like I said, as seamlessly as I can, what I want to do is just give people a sense of, I think, how we address then this political situation. I may be leaving certain things ambiguous, but we can have it up. We can take it up in discussion. And that is the basis for this moment in history, why this has come together. Some people would assume that somehow we just ended up here. That history just ended up where the British Empire system, the system of kind of extraction of resources, building up of certain entities, nations competing against each other, that process eventually ran its course, and we now ended up at a point, we're now at a potentially beautiful juncture. We don't necessarily know most of the accounts of this, but we could probably presume that for most of human history, the opposite has happened. That at moments where that system, where any one system begins to break down, the authorities at the time had maintained and executed a power of mass execution of the population. That they were successfully able to implement a policy of mass death, of a mass kill. Hence, the idea that all of global warming and the environmental movement is premised on the fact that there's too many people. You create the justification for what is a policy of mass population reduction. So to say that we have all these projects developing, we now have an administration that's come in that's intending to at least confront directly, publicly, and explicitly this very fascist establishment inside the United States and in the transatlantic community generally. And let's be honest, this is fascist. I mean, war with Russia, too many people, a massive police surveillance state. This is pretty close to the Nazis. I mean, you can't get more fascist than how we're currently operating. You couldn't get more fascist than Hillary Clinton's campaign.
How ironic.
Yeah, you couldn't get more fascist than Obama's presidency. Targeted assassinations and killing of people globally.
Overthrowing governments.
Overthrowing governments, yeah. So, so it's worth considering that this potential that we have, these transformative projects globally. And let's be honest, I've left certain maybe main things out, but I've raised the question of Russia. Mr. LaRouche, the founder of this organization, was very clear about about a year ago, where he said Vladimir Putin would play a large role in determining the presidential election. And he did. But not the way that they're accusing. His intervention into Syria, a demonstration that the policies of the United States were not just incompetent, they were insane. They were psychotic. That you had a kind of policy that was demonic, controlling the United States. And the exposure of that undermined this entire establishment and administration in the eyes of an increasing number of Americans. At the same time, it gave the American people a sense of, but it is possible to do what's right. We're completely wrong, and what's right is feasible. The government can take the actions that are in the best interest of the world and of their own country. Because of Vladimir Putin's unique action in that way, which was sustained throughout the course of this past year and a half, it was a substantial intervention into the process. So let me be a little bit off course, but let me just, did we have to end up here at this point where there is a unique potential? There's a unique potential to work with Russia and China, clearly the more dominant nations on the planet. There's a potential to develop Africa, to take on the United States' role as John Quincy Adams saw it, and really develop the entire Americas. These questions. Was that inevitable? I'd say absolutely not. So how did it happen? In most cases in human history, it didn't happen. Now, many people in this room are well aware and were actually involved in campaigning the last 8 years with LaRouche PAC throughout many of the areas that gave President Trump the election. Well, while President Trump, with no criticism towards him, except maybe a certain insufficiency, he challenged Obama's legitimacy. He came out and did challenge Obama's citizenship, which was it's a legitimate question to ask with this president in every possible way. But was he organizing them around ending the wars for the last 8 years? He might have been against them. Was he organizing them around infrastructure and developing the United States around large-scale manufacturing, infrastructure, space program? Was he organizing them around taking on Wall Street, Glass-Steagall policies? Was he giving them a sense of the kind of water development projects that could develop the Western states? Or the possible collaboration of the US and Russia and its historic relationship? President Trump may have been for all of those things. He certainly has made references to all of them over the last just couple of days, he and his top advisors. But we were the ones organizing that. We were the ones shaping this political discussion of this country. We were the ones engaged in the discussions with the Tea Party. We ratted out. We exposed some of the more devious aspects of the Tea Party, like their siding with Winston Churchill and the British outlook here in Texas. But we also talked to a lot of them about large-scale projects, about large-scale industry, about large-scale infrastructure, and how we would fund it, how it would work, that's how we have to rebuild the country. We made that possible. Now, I just say that because it's important. Oftentimes people want to look at the events and say the election. Trump won, Trump did it. Well, and Trump certainly went in there and cleaned house with the Republican Party and the Obama campaign. It was more Obama campaign than even Hillary Clinton. Yeah, absolutely. But that wasn't shaping the political process of the entire country. I mean, before even the Republican Party, I think people may know this in Texas, but the Republican Party was likely going to support Obamacare when it first came out. It was a Republican, it was like the Heritage Foundation's prescription for healthcare reform. It was Romney's policies in Massachusetts. This was exchanges. They just got a Democrat to pay federal money to the private insurance companies. I mean, it was just so they would have gone along with it. We were the ones who intervened. We were the ones. Sarah Palin echoed it on the question of death panels. We made it clear it was a Nazi healthcare policy. That's probably the same reason why when the British intelligence and MI6 put together a slut dossier against President Trump, they can't help but reference Mr. LaRouche in the dossier. It's why within a couple of days of us talking about the Croc Canal, the British Empire's agents in Singapore can't help but freak out about the LaRouche Pact's role in shaping the Croc Canal project. Because there's something about the way our organization works. And I can tell you, as many people in this room know, we are small, we are totally underfunded, and yet we somehow have the ability to shape the kind of, not just the small events, but to shape the large characteristic of the course of the process of history that's now unfolding. So what I want to do in the few minutes I have in terms of my initial comments is to give some sense of Mr. LaRouche's try to take his own reflections on his own unique qualities of why he was capable of making this intervention and why our organization, as it assimilates and develops that quality of thinking, was also able to shape this process of history for the last 50 years, but for the 50 years to come. That's the intention. We're asking people to participate now in writing this book and to ensure that not only have we escaped what could have been the darkest days of humanity in all of God's creation. We thought the last 15 years were a dark age. Had Hillary Clinton won, we might be in nuclear war now, or not. You know, the obvious conclusions of that. It was close.
It was close.
It was close.
Yeah.
As bad as Hillary Clinton was, it was close. So we better take this opportunity and develop it. And that's what Mr. LaRouche's method is based on. So what I want to take up is I'll try to develop, he takes up something in a paper we recently republished. It's a paper written in 1987 as he was running for president in defense of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. I'm a little cautious to present it, so I'll present it perhaps in a certain way, because Mr. LaRouche is always he's always preferred us not to try to talk about things he did in the past, but to capture his way of thinking now. Because his way of thinking from 30 years ago has changed dramatically. So how he would approach it would be different. So I put a disclaimer that I want you to take it as an aspect of looking at how his thought existed in 1987, which at least will give you some context, an approximation for how his thought developed over the last 30 years. So to do that, I want to give you a sense of what I think is a very encapsulated statement he made just recently about his own way of thinking. There was a discussion on, I believe after the election, soon after the election, around it might have been, maybe it was even before. I hardly remember. But it was very recent, and it was on the question of Albert Einstein. And he referenced that you have to look at the electromagnetic system of mankind. He said, we don't know what Einstein discovered, but we know he discovered something. And we know it's true. But we don't yet quite know what it is. Yet we know that it deals with the electromagnetic system of mankind. This, that's to me, that's very provocative. Because what does he mean first by electromagnetic system of mankind? I think everyone in this room is comfortable saying, we think Einstein discovered something true and we don't know what it is. That part we're safe saying. But why are you comfortable saying that? If you don't know what it is, how do you know it's true? Well, let me ask you the inverse question. Describe something to me, describe what something is that you know to be true. Does anyone know anything to be true? Who knows something to be true? Okay, what is it?
That man is made in the image of his creator.
Okay, I mean, we could open that up, right? What is man? What is the creator? Yeah. But there's a quality that something's true is not something that is clear necessarily. It's not something. It's certainly not something of a simple logical argument. And so what I would say in this is that there's two aspects to Mr. LaRouche's unique discovery. And what he captured in this quality was the most important aspect. How does it that mankind has access to that which is true? Is something true because your parents repeated it often in childhood? How many people question things that they were told in childhood when they got older? Right? Most people in this room, I imagine, probably did. Is it something true because someone can prove it to you in a logical sequence? Can someone argue you to the point where you accept that what they say is absolutely true? I don't mean just right. I don't mean acceptable. I don't mean what difference does it make anyways, kind of true. I mean true to the point where it has a sense of human existence. Now, this might seem abstract, but what Mr. LaRouche came upon, which was similar to Albert Einstein, there's a funny story. Einstein was supposed to get an award. I think it was in Prague, or maybe it was in Budapest. He was supposed to get an award. And there was a couple of other physicists getting awards. And so it was his turn to get the award and give a speech. So they had the award, and they said, okay, Albert, come on up and accept your award and give a speech. Nobody could, where is he? Where is he? And then all of a sudden he came out of a side door, had his violin in his hand, and he said, and he played them something on the violin for Mozart. He said, that's my acceptance speech, thank you very much. Well, why? No, it's sweet, it's endearing, it's definitely not, some horribly boring academic, mathematical speech or something. But it also indicates the way Einstein thought about the process. Because it is an unusual thing. The experience of discovery of something true is not in is not through argumentation. It is not through a set of just simple facts. There's a characteristic about mankind, about the human mind, that's entirely not practical. And in some ways, what Einstein discovers is that electromagnetic system of mankind. So this is partly why Mr. LaRouche, or I'd say to a large extent, for example, why did we set up the Manhattan Project? We've now held a series of interventions into US foreign policy through music. We've created, as leading Russian, or I don't know, they're leading Russian citizens, I would say, have put it, we did more in 3 minutes to save and ensure a collaborative effort between US and Russian relations than Obama did in 8 years. In 3 minutes, with a song and a commemoration for Russian sacrifices in the process of the Syrian war, we've helped to set a foundation for new relationships among nations. You now have the Trump team referencing the relationship of the US and the Soviet Union and the long history of US-Russian relations and collaboration. And it actually goes, as we know, goes far back before World War II. But there's something about how does that captivate people? How does that bring them into something where they act upon it as if they know it to be true? And that's often the difference, isn't it? If you want to gauge if someone knows something to be true or not, see how they act. And you'll see. If they know something to be true, they'll act one way. If they find themselves, for a simple example, if they find themselves of value, will they become a drug addict? Probably not. If they find themselves to have little value in society, they're not worth much. Will that person probably have a series of problems that they encounter and self-destructive tendencies? Absolutely. So it's a question of, but how do you create that sense of identity? How do you create that sense of identity, not just in the individual, but within society as a whole? And Einstein's discovery perhaps gets us there. Now, what's interesting is that, going back to this paper from 1987 then, that Mr. LaRouche, his notion of economics, he made a unique discovery. He recognized that there was a quality of economics which was consistent with this higher, more abstract conception. Because real discoveries, even some of the Silicon Valley billionaires actually can recognize this. There's one guy who's actually an advisor to Trump, Peter Thiel. And he said this recently. He says, so you've got all these Silicon Valley billionaires, and they haven't created a point of a percentage of value that Albert Einstein created. Yet they're billionaires and he wasn't. So it's clear to at least some people who are thinking, Albert Einstein created a massive, nearly infinite value for human economy. Nuclear power plants, the potentiality of fusion, laser beams, satellites, you name it. Without Einstein's discovery, none of that would have been possible. So Mr. LaRouche recognized these discoveries have a huge impact. And that the idea that just taking every possible input you can imagine into an economic system will never give you a sense of what's going to come out of that economic system. Because there's something that takes place in a human economy which is unique to the human mind. The factor of discovery plays a role in shaping what inputs end up becoming what outputs. That's defined. And it was defined in 3 ways. He thought were the most important questions to look at. One is the energy available to society. Because the question is, can we create infinite supply of energy? In the 1940s, leading scientists in the United States imagined, through the breakthroughs of fusion energy, the energy would become essentially free and infinite. What would you do if you had infinite energy? If you could put a refrigerator, You know what a refrigerator does? It reverses what's supposed to naturally happen. What if you could reverse anything you wanted to? In infinite electricity, all you had to do was set up a machine. It's just an interesting question. What would you do? Because the most expensive thing, every parent tells their child, close that door. Every person grows up with that. Why? Because that thing costs money. You're paying a lot of electricity for that machine. What if that didn't cost anything anymore? Would kids just leave the door or open it? I don't know. Not a good idea. But what would you do as a society? That's the one question that, we discussed this often more in depth recently in California, because the whole discussion of our society today is how do you consume less electricity? The whole society is that. We talk about light bulbs consuming less electricity. I just like to have nicer light bulbs. Ones that don't make noise, nice light, don't hurt your eyes. I don't care how much electricity they consume. I'm not worried about that. But the whole discussion is on that question. Okay, so that's the first thing he raised. And this is in 1987, but it's still relevant today at some level. But I would premise it, just to make it clear, that this Einstein conception, this role of music, like we did this concert on Thursday night here in Houston, I would say Mr. LaRouche recognizes, besides everything else I'm going to cover, that question of action, to develop an idea that's true in people's minds so that they act upon it with real volition, that's the most important question today. People don't know much anymore. And the things they thought they knew have been so attacked by every media institution and cultural institution and academic source that they question it. There's no sense of just traditional culture that just moves forward in the United States. So providing people a sense of truth in their own mind that they measure and can act upon is probably the most important. But then to know how we're actually going to execute policy still remains important. In 1987, I would say there are still people in the United States that knew things to be true, that didn't compromise them. 30 years later, like we said with inner city education, we were talking about that 40, 50 years ago. Now you got cell phones and internet activity in a classroom. I can't even imagine what some of these schools would be like under these circumstances. So things have changed in terms of what our priorities are in terms of organizing this change in policy. But the first thing he referenced in 87 was this energy supply. The second thing is what he calls energy flux density. Now, people are likely familiar with it, but just to review it, in essence, it's a question of temperature. How hot can you get something to be over a very small area? Or how much electricity can you produce per square area? So there's always the relevant example, as people know, the city of San Francisco, it's on a peninsula, and it's cut off. It's almost like a little island. The city is. If you wanted to provide enough electricity to power San Francisco City, you have to, with windmills, you'd have to cover the entire land area with windmills. If you wanted to provide it with nuclear power plant, you could put it where the zoo is, which is in the southwest corner by the ocean. Put a nuclear power plant there and it would run the whole city. What's a better use of land area? That notion is a conception of energy flux density. And with fusion, the temperatures we're operating a nuclear power plant may approach 1,000 degrees Celsius, approximately. The temperatures of a fusion plant are, is it 100 million?
Yeah.
Is that what it is, Joe? About 100 million to 300 million? Yeah.
100 million.
So you're saying fission versus
Fusion.
fission to fusion.
Fission to fusion is about 1,000 degrees Celsius to about 100 million degrees Celsius. 5 orders of magnitude. Within practically the same size facility. And the source of fuel is just the seawater. Processed, but practically infinite electricity. So that advancement is key. And Keisha and I went and met with some NASA rocket scientists. And it's kind of fun. They were like 25 leading NASA rocket scientists who who built the Saturn V rocket. I mean, these were like people who worked, they're essentially retired, you know, almost forced retirement. Like they'd all want to be still, they're all practically working. Now they're trying to work to stop this fraud of global warming. They're leading rocket scientists. And you can tell that they were captivated by accomplishing something that mankind had never done before. But I talked to one of the leading figures who worked with NASA the entire time, Ed Johnson, on the manned program from '63 and just retired about 5 years ago.
Who?
His name is Ken Young.
Jimmy.
Huh?
No, never.
It's somebody different, I think. So, he also, as Mr. LaRouche said, we don't need to put human beings on Mars. That's not the main task. We can do so much today with robotics that it's approximating far better today the kinds of decision makings you would want that you can get from human beings. You put a human being scientist on the moon, like Harrison Schmitt, the one geologist we finally got up there. And what, 74? 72. He could make decisions about what he was looking for in terms of exploration. But these Curiosity on Mars is remarkable robotics. So we need a combined aspect of robotics and manned exploration. Okay. And we're going to do things that have never been done before. But the true leap at this point is going to be around the capacity for fusion. Because not only does fusion provide electricity, provides propulsion, provides new materials, provides an ability for industrial development on the moon or Mars, far beyond anything we could imagine. And this gets the last point Mr. LaRouche references, which is the level of technology. And it's hard to deal with this one in a society that's post-industrial. Most people think of technology, you think of, at least in California, you think of these. This is technology. It's funny though, because you just see how language changes. Doesn't technology seem to propose a study of something? Doesn't the word in its nature seem to suggest that it's a study of something?
Yeah, ology.
Yeah.
From the Greek word.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a knowledge or study of something. Like biology is the study of life. Psychology is the study of human psyche. What's the technology a study of? Anybody know? Techniques. Okay. What's that mean? Like massage techniques, right? And that's what I mean by in post-industrial society, when you've got more massage therapists than you do electrical engineers, people think of techniques and they're thinking like Karma Sutra or something.
Then you can use
So, but there was a study of how machines actually, some machines are more productive, how some designs of advanced industrial machinery accomplish the task necessary far more effectively than others. And in a society which is incredibly productive, with heavy industrial orientation, the difference between a machine producing something in an hour versus producing it in 6 hours would be a big difference. And it would be simply the way that machine was designed, how that technology had been conceived and organized around a principle. Something like laser-based machine tooling. In 1987, there was an advent of the development of laser-based machine tools. They're somewhat now commonplace. But it's hard to understand how they would be applied to a very advanced manufacturing system. We don't necessarily have that. But that kind of changes are imperative towards an economic process. Now, the reason Mr. LaRouche laid these out is because all of them are a direct effect of the ability of creative thinking, as expressed by someone like Einstein. I was going to, I don't know if I still will. Are there markers for that?
Yeah, right there, right there.
They're right there?
Well, I think they should be. There may be.
I have an eraser. It's not the biggest deal. Huh?
No, it's not.
Oh, is that not a erase? Is that a dry erase?
I just assumed there was a ledge that had them, so I forgot to ask. That looks like one.
No. Right, left, and right.
Yeah.
Dry erase, this is one. Oh, you got one? Who knows how dry they might be. Okay.
Who knows which one works?
All right, so I'm gonna. This is I'm gonna develop this only because I think it's somewhat interesting. The same. So Mr. LaRouche, as a young man, and looking at this question of economics, he was about in his late 20s and early 30s when he really developed this conception and this quality. He had to look at, well, how do I come up with, is there a means of communicating this kind of process of human economy? Whether you can capture it as a knowable system, that you can communicate it clearly to other people that this is actually how the human economy functions. And we have a way of mapping that or of measuring it. In essence, that means, can you find unfortunately, but it's still interesting, can you find a mathematical language? Can you find a language, which in this sense would be mathematics, to capture this kind of physical process? Well, the mathematics he came upon was the same mathematics that Einstein came upon to capture that electromagnetic system that was characteristic of the universe at large and also in the very small. And there's a certain example of this quality which is just useful. It helps the mind to clarify some of the conceptions. So I'll present it, and then we'll open up for some discussion. Okay, so what I've drawn on the board is a sphere. This is the basis for at least starting with this school of mathematics. Now, what's interesting is that this school of mathematical thought comes out of the leading scientists involved in looking at how do we advance economic processes? How do we advance the actual development of electricity? And its characteristic came out of this school of scientific thought. From Mr. LaRouche's standpoint, though, and as for Einstein, this became an expression of a field, something like a gravitational field. It captured and expressed it in geometric form, or in a form of language. How do you communicate a gravitational field in some way? You have to find a language. This is the language that Einstein also found. What's the field of economics? Or what's the context by which economic processes happen? Or in some sense, what's the far hearing? What's the broader context by which economic activity proceeds in? Well, in some cases, some people might say it's the infrastructure. The infrastructure you set up allows for the manufacturing and the industry and the overall productive process to happen every day. That's true. That's absolutely a key characteristic of our program for development. But then there's something even beyond that. Because are the American people unaware of the importance of infrastructure? Does everybody like driving on bad roads? Or in Houston, do you like driving on roads that get flooded? Is that, I mean, people describe the stories, it's almost like nightmarish to be driving down a road and all of a sudden you find out it's flooded and you're like driving for your life at that point. So are people unaware that infrastructure is important? Is that why we haven't developed it? Likely not. Likely somebody decided we're just going to keep looting the system and just ignore the fact that we need to rebuild our infrastructure. Some institution, Wall Street, London, these institutions decided we're just going to loot the population and not rebuild their society. So the field of economics from this higher standpoint would be that this is a characteristic of human culture. That's what you're actually grasping. How do we measure the actual cultural process itself that's enabling these discoveries to take place? Well, this is what Riemann does. he recognizes, what if we take the sphere, but yet we introduce a hole into the sphere? Well, it doesn't really change. The sphere can be turned into the hole. It's a knowable means by which you would, it's knowable within the mathematical language to find equivalence between the two. To turn the sphere into a donut is knowable. And yet every single point on the sphere is different than every location on the donut. Everything changes about the characteristic. And Mr. LaRouche said, because that's what we're getting in processes of real transformation. That's what we have to be able to create. That's what these projects, these transformative projects, enable within an entire region. What the Kra Canal would do in Southeast Asia. And it continues. I don't know if I can draw this one as well. You can do it a second time. You can continue to change it, and each process, it's knowable to change it from one whole donut to a two-hole donut. There's a certain characteristic of change, and yet the process of the sphere as a concept, as a language, is still maintained in each case. It's still a quality of curvature that's maintained as a concept. But yet it's drastic. It's the whole thing is transformed. And that's really the unique characteristic of human society, is that we are capable, by unique individual, by voluntary action, to change and transform our entire society. But in doing so, it doesn't mean that society becomes disrupted. Society has a continuity to it. It will continue to develop, but yet its entire operations will change. Now, the problem with this language is that this detracts from a higher quality of beauty, a higher quality of inspiration, that people like Beethoven or Mozart or the great composers grasped around the same concept. They captured that quality of truth that Riemann recognized, that Riemann understood, but they captured in a way that where a culture had lost a sense of that, it could be reawakened. So hence, Mr. LaRouche's emphasis perhaps in 1987. Today, it is on this quality that we just performed on Thursday night here. We're having an event February 18th. Is that right? 16th. February 16th. At the, at Texas Southern University. That's right. At the Foreign Policy, or Public Policy Institute. People can come to that, and if you're in the area, you should come to it. But it's the same thing we've done. We ran a campaign as an organization the last 2 years. That campaign was the Manhattan Project. It was largely based on a major intervention that culminated with 4 concerts of Mozart's Requiem on the anniversary, the 15th anniversary of 9/11. At the very time that Congress had finally decided to reject Obama, to reject this insane terrorist program of Obama, the backing of terrorism, the support of terrorism, the cover for terrorism. Congress finally took it on at the very moments that our campaign in Manhattan had culminated with these concerts. Because you have to awaken this quality of truth in the minds of a population. Underlying it is a scientific method. I guess that's what Mr. LaRouche was presenting in 1987. And that's important to understand, but even more important is to execute it. And I think we really have a unique moment at this point to act upon this administration. This administration isn't yet formed. It's somewhat still amorphous. It's got a commitment, it's got a fight, it's going to take on the enemies of our country, it's going to work with nations to knock out terrorism. But how do you knock out terrorism for good? You got to bring in jobs. You got to bring in a future. You got to bring in water and power and development. You got to give those 16-year-old young men and 18-year-old young men a better life ahead of them, clearly, than they have joining ISIS or Al-Qaeda. The same thing is true in Cleveland as it is in Baghdad. There's a universal quality to human identity. And you have to touch that, you have to develop it, and the United States plays a leading role in that process. If we do, then we do really establish a different system on this planet than has ever existed before. And our scientific pursuits, our cultural expressions are going to see rapid transformation. But it's going to take a lot of work. The first step has got to be Glass-Steagall. That's the first act of transformation we have to create. So I will, so maybe a lot, but that's what I wanted to present today. So we've got a good audience here. Maybe we have some thoughts or questions on the whole situation. Yeah.
You've got a problem now. Would that be a sea level canal? Or would you have?
No, I believe it wouldn't be, no.
Yeah,
You have lots.
there's no locks.
So
It is entirely sea level all the way through?
Yeah.
Even at 218 feet, it's pretty high at certain points.
Well, it could be. I mean, you know, we were talking about using nuclear.
We could be, yeah, I know it certainly could be. I don't know what the current plan is, but I think Joel's right. It certainly could be if that's the plan. So it's very possible. There was Edward Teller, who was a major advocate for this project in the 80s, said if we use peaceful nuclear explosives, there's all this concern of radiation contamination. He says, if we use PNEs, I will move my family there and have a house, and we will live there on the canal. This is the guy that developed the hydrogen bomb, yeah. So these are the options, and it would really, I mean, we've done, I think it's in our documentary, isn't it, that we actually go through how much faster the excavation process would be.
Yeah,
It's a massive change. Why not? I mean, if we got dynamite, why not use some nukes, man? So, anyways. Any other questions? That's a good one.
Just out of curiosity, I noticed that there's a group of people we have totally left out,
Yeah.
and that is the Native Americans. They are involved in, they're not, even the title or topic of citizenship is really vague, because they are run by tribes, they're tribal leaders. That's in a lot of the area in the United States where they're talking about nuclear energy, it's on their land. And one of the things Obama did, because I'm not an Obama fan at all,
Yeah.
but he came to bat for the Native Americans and has bought back an awful lot of the land. But there's one of them, I just heard about it in the last week or two. There is an area where they're trying to build some kind of nuclear facility or something that is on their land, and they don't want it.
This is a complicated question. I've thought about it recently. I don't know what Mr. LaRouche would say. It's a complicated question, though. You take, for example, the way Russia and China have dealt with their indigenous populations. It's drastically different. But they've somewhat lived in the same vicinity with each other for thousands of years. Just some developed into the dominant culture that was advancing, while other cultures remained somewhat isolated in their own nature. We've got a lot of this in China, like in this area along the Yunnan, Sichuan area. in the hill areas. So the problem is that you had an operation run within the American colonies to pit the colonies against the Indians. The Indians were essentially used as a geopolitical force, like we see with the terrorists today. And you then had a forced dynamic that was created. And then you had the genocidal policies of people like Andrew Jackson. So the destruction to the populations here, whereas if you go to the American Portrait Museum in Washington, D.C., they've got a series of like 5 or 6 portraits of American and early settlers who were actually translating, European texts, including the Bible, but other texts into the Iroquois language, into their languages, the Algonquin. There was actually a sense of outreach, a cultural dialogue. These are people, these are human beings. There was a sense of collaboration, and that you would have had if that had been the dominant force of American colonial policy. But instead, we were under direct attack from British and French colonial interests, especially the British imperial interests as it consolidated. And they used these Indians, these Native Americans, as a way of disrupting the settlement of a new kind of culture. So it becomes more complicated because of that. Today, these reservations are dominated by this casino culture. And it's sick. It's largely a complete abuse of this population once again. So the most important thing is to identify the human quality within our society generally, and to create a sense of advancement within that human creative capacity. It's much like you had with the first Native American president in Mexico, Jose Lopez Portillo. You incorporate all human beings within our nation into participating in the advancement of mankind, not simply through culturally predisposed, what we like, but through an advanced culture like what we saw with Einstein, a discovery of the universe, and the application of that discovery to the benefit of solving the problems that our society faces. That's really the only way to address this problem at any point in human history. Unfortunately, we just have a bad legacy. And to atone for it, I think we just have to commit to the development. The same way that West European civilization has to atone for the destruction of Africa. That has to be done. But how? Is it to let Africa go back to where it was before European industrialization? That seems to be what we intend to be doing right now.
That's the Obama.
That's the Obama policy. Let's give Africa back to the Africans from 1550. Not really what Africa would benefit from.
But with solar power light bulbs.
Yeah. So and wireless, iPads. So connection to the internet. So I think that commitment has to be there. That's why this question of scientific advancement as a policy is not some kind of European hubris of culture. It is the very most compassionate way of addressing the problems we faced in society today on even a cultural level. So
A lot of these stories are manipulated by families, but the best story is the one that Tim Rush is, that he was in the Peace Corps. This is one of our old members in the Peaceburg. And he was in Chiapas region in 1969.
In Mexico?
In Mexico, or maybe it was Peru. I forget which one, but it was right before the moon landing. And there was one television set for the whole village. And all the Indians, indigenous Indians, were gathered around the TV to see man land on the moon. And all the ecologists and all the archaeologists were bad-mouthing the moon mission. But all the native Indians were curious to see man land on the moon. So you have all these trained ecologists saying this is a waste of money, but the Indians wanted to see man develop.
that's a good story.
It's a good start.
Right, we using that. But you see, what they do is they say now with this uranium, they say, well, we can't reprocess fuel, so we're going to bury it in some Indian territory instead of going to
The yeah. Yeah.
There's also on the law question, there's tribal law, right, there's Indian law, and then there's US law.
Yeah.
I was a bit curious about the Marshall Plan. It originated during Eisenhower's time, or
Truman.
Yeah.
You know, I think I mentioned here earlier, in early 60s, American agriculturists went and set up a university in Bangladesh. That is the only agricultural university till today. And Bangladesh being a country of 55,000 square miles, it is self-sufficient in food for 160 million people. And a lot of this achievement was possible because of that agriculture university. There are thousands of agronomists being employed by the, not agronomists, I mean agricultural.
Yeah.
They're being employed by the government, and we have all this high-yielding variety of paddy. That has enabled us to feed our own people from this tiny piece of land. I think Marshall Plan kind of thing, those were the good days when America had a mission for the whole world.
Right. Well, that's the question. I mean, what Helga LaRouche has made very clear is that this New Silk Road project from China, the 38 routes now, the 6 corridors going to Europe, and the Maritime Silk Road. The basic assessment is that this area, which is the large area of the direct advancement from the Silk Road project, is 12 times the size of the Marshall Plan. And not just simply an area of land, it's much larger, but in terms of investment, in terms of size of projects, in terms of overall production changes. So this is, it's almost unfathomable. And the American people are completely unaware of what's taking place globally within human culture. They don't know about the transformations that are taking place. They act as if they're just living in some flat world that never changes. And in reality is there are huge transformations taking place within human society.
We can blame the US news media for that.
Yeah, right. That's why this organization becomes increasingly important. We were talking about it the other day. We did an extensive study on John Kennedy around the water development project called NWAPA. This is the best map. This is the NWAPA map, basically. NWAPA basically starts up here and goes all the way down to Mexico. This massive water development project. I'm gonna stay here. So the New York Times, John Kennedy was advocating for these projects. He was out building dams. He was out building reservoirs. He was out celebrating them. He was going out to the West. He says, in Massachusetts, the problem is we've got too much water. Out here in Colorado, you don't have enough. And people out in the Northeast have no idea what Colorado's like. This is 1962. But Kennedy was advocating this. How much did the New York Times talk about Kennedy's advocacy for major water development projects in the West, just like Franklin Roosevelt had done? How much did the New York Times, the Washington Post discuss Kennedy's advocacy for national sovereignty of the colonial nations of Africa and working with those leaders? That was the intrinsic mission of the Peace Corps, was to free these nations from this kind of colonial world and to develop their industry and science. New York Times, Washington Post never talked about that. Are these institutions, are any of these media going to discuss the New Silk Road? Have they even yet? You get a few references in Forbes magazine. There's a couple of articles. Here and there's a couple of references. It's not going to become part of the American dynamic, but it can now with the new administration. Just like we can change the entire scientific discussion out of this fraud of global warming. But how are you going to educate the American people on these projects? It's got to be through an operation like ours. We've got to grow it. We've got to develop it. We've got to find ways of doing it. That's not obvious. Unlike the 1960s and 70s, when a bunch of young people were on college campuses freaked out they were all going to get nuked in nuclear war, or just thought the United States was insane for running these illegal wars, and were responsive, or at least reacting to it. Today, the young people are unresponsive. They don't like what's happening, but there's not the same internal conviction. And so how we create that is going to take a lot of creative thought and effort. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, these weirdo professors on campuses now are telling their students that the election of Trump was a terroristic act.
Right, right.
They're telling them stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean,
They're flunking students because they're conservative.
it's true. It's true. I mean, we have been dominated by a Nazi cult.
Another way that shows itself is that you made a comment about, from the standpoint of your discussion with Hamilton about, how does the individual discover self-worth, and, how do they find within them, you're implicitly saying, how do they find within themselves this quality of creativity, which is necessary for society to grow and develop, and then exercise that in some fashion in society. Well, you all know the story. I mean, I see this all the time when I'm at school. I've retired from teaching, but I still substitute. The level of insanity which grips the whole institution is based really on this idea that it's not, your self-worth is determined by what you are now.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to celebrate you now. You're a failure, you're wonderful. You don't participate actively and constructively with other human beings. That's you. That's great. That's the mentality. So how do you get a society to go from that characteristic of I'm who I am. I like to put a knife in my mother's back. That makes me okay. Because that's me. That's who I am. That's what I feel like. And it's that's the kind of insanity that's out there, and which is why what we did Thursday night, what we've been doing in New York and other places, is so incredibly important, because it is the music that more efficiently reaches the soul of people than just about anything else. And great music opens the door for the creative potential of the listener, and that's something that they feel. That's something that they imbibe it, whether they think about it or not. It's imbibed into their soul, and that is the key thing for bringing us out of this insanity. Which is why what I'd love to see is schools should be a cultural sort of paradise, mm-hmm. a place where you go to be cut off from the lunacy in the popular culture, mm-hmm. right? Instead of being promoters of popular culture, which is what they tend to do. I mean, I was in an elementary school the other day where they actually, at breaks or whatever, they actually had, Bach, Vivaldi, coming through the speakers, which I thought was quite unusual.
That is very unusual.
Well, it is funny, but you're starting to get this reaction. It's almost as if it's that hyperbolic tendency that you go so far that it snaps back and comes the other way, where that you just end up, the pop culture has run its course to such an extent. All they can do is kind of regurgitate what's the 40 years of pop culture. There's nothing more to give in pop culture. All of TV is basically shows of people singing songs that have been sung by pop singers for the last 40 years. There's no other new songs. It's just the same old ones getting regurgitated. And you start to get this sense where it's snapping, that it's only gone so far that you have to introduce something. There was what was the reference? We all have a different reference point to it, but there's been psychiatrists. There was a particular psychiatrist that prescribed Mozart for people that were unhealthy. They help stabilize their emotions. I mean, at some point you'll just find it's just to nourish, just to calm people down, just to stop people from going so crazy. They'll find that this music has an effect. They won't know why. They won't necessarily think it's classical culture. They won't make it a theory. they'll just say it's working. It's calming people down. They can actually listen. They actually sit in their classes and they don't try to kill each other, right? They're not watching pornography, videos in 4th grade in my math class. Like you just, you've got to prevent some of those things from happening, but you can realize it's going too far.
But it's also prescribed for healing.
Yeah. So there's characteristics to it.
Somebody goes through surgery.
Very important for stroke patients.
Something about that it touches the human mind, and that's the thing. That's the same thing that I think Lynn captured with this Einstein question. It's like, well, why does it do that?
Well, because there's an ordering principle of the geometry of the music that's corresponds to.
Yeah, that's the hypothesis. It's not clear what that. The funny thing is, it's not clear what that means. In essence, there's more to discover about this characteristic.
So it's like the question, what is life?
Yeah, we all know who doesn't know they're alive. Okay, then you say, well, what is life? And you end up with a funny problem. So you know it to be true, undeniably. And if you don't, then we have to get some help. But so there's that characteristic, and this question of how that touches the mind, and why that might be the most that quality is the most advanced scientific characteristic of the human mind. Versus the people who think of themselves from the standpoint of science as mathematics, they can do the mathematics. Or the people that really just like science, people that they get these people who think the space program's a hobby. I just like space. I like space. I like rockets. It's like, well, that's nice, but someone like Kraft Erica, who worked with us and was a leading space pioneer, he saw it as a vehicle to take man beyond the current limitations. He thought as an actual historical phenomena of evolution. It wasn't just a hobby for him. It wasn't just neat things to play with. It was something of a grandeur of mankind's nature. But that quality, how do we access that? So, all right, well, this has been a fun discussion, and I appreciate the opportunity to present. So thanks for letting me do that.
Thank you.